The working group on wildlife was quite busy last year. Several of the main accomplishments include a statement that was released in April 2020 on wildlife trade and emerging zoonotic diseases. And the purpose of that statement was to highlight the complexity and the issues, risks and benefits around the wildlife trade, and a great need to support legal, sustainable, and responsible wildlife use, and also the need for guidance, standards, risk assessments, and risk management tools. The other point was assisting with the OIE concept note for a wildlife health framework. This is a novel OIE approach that includes the concepts of One Health, healthy environments, and the relevance of biodiversity and contributing to essential ecosystem services. And this is a framework that requires collaboration from all the member countries and delegates, and we encourage your active participation. Third, the Working Group on Wildlife worked with the IUCN to develop guidelines for working with free-ranging wild mammals in the times of COVID. And the main goal of that was to provide best practices and guidelines to avoid inadvertent spillover of SARS-CoV-2 into wild animal populations. And lastly, we performed a revision of a recently released document by the WHO, OIE, and UNEP on reducing public health risks associated with the sale of live wild mammals and mammalian species in traditional food markets. And the main point here was to provide guidelines to countries so that they could implement safety guidelines around traditional markets, and particularly recognizing the role that they play in providing food and livelihoods for populations, but also the zoonotic disease risk associated with them. And finally, I want to highlight new and emerging issues that we identified over the last year. And some particular cases are elephant deaths that were recorded in Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. And particularly want to highlight the difficulties in diagnosing, investigating and diagnosing the causes of these deaths that were attributed in some cases to cyanobacteria in Botswana, anthrax in Namibia, these were unconfirmed, and then Pastorella multocida in Zimbabwe. We also noted the first report of African horse sickness in Southeast Asia, and these were led to thousands of cases and equine in Thailand especially, and it was attributed to importation of infected zebras from Africa. And the last point would be large-scale outbreaks of rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus 2 in the US, southwestern US and Mexico, involving both wild and domestic lagomorphs, and also several outbreaks of this same disease in the UK. And the relevance of this is that because of the potential for this virus to infect free-ranging lagomorph, it could become a relevant conservation concern disease. So as was the case for everyone, we of course had to deal with the COVID pandemic last year, but particularly challenging was to be available to answer all the requests and concerns over wildlife and the wildlife trade in relation to the COVID pandemic. While simultaneously we were trying to work on broader issues such as the OIE concept note on the wildlife health framework, the IUCN OIE guidelines for working safely with wild mammals to avoid spillover of SARS-CoV-2, as well as providing input and expert advice to the WHO, OIE, UNEP recommendations and guidelines for reducing risk from live animal markets. So our plans for the immediate future are to contribute to the technical item that will be presented at the general session on wildlife health and disease spillover events at the human, livestock, and wildlife interface. Also, participation of the working group on wildlife and the ad hoc group convened to develop guidelines on reducing the risk of spillover pathogen events at markets selling wildlife and along the wildlife supply chain. Several actions to improve investigation, recording, and reporting of disease events and wildlife, which will include things like enhancing the capacities and active roles of wildlife focal points, exploring mechanisms in which we can help OIE members to build a national level wildlife disease surveillance capacity or improve it where it exists. Set up a procedure for notification and investigation of wildlife disease events that involves the wildlife focal points and delegates, OIE partners, and also the OIE collaborating centers for diagnostics in a network framework. Also, the need for addressing the need to improve surveillance of wildlife diseases. We're considering developing a chapter in the Terrestrial Animal Health Code on the surveillance of diseases and wildlife at the national level. And this will be based on Chapter 1.4, Animal Health Surveillance, and Chapter 4.15, Official Health Control of Bee Diseases. Those will be the references. And finally, explore with the PBS tool team whether more information on wildlife health management capabilities and needs can be included. And for this, we will also explore potential other assessment tools that can be adapted for OIE purposes, such as the JE, World Bank references, etc. In alignment with our ongoing requests to increase efforts in reporting wildlife disease events, and considering especially that Guajis Wild will not be operational this year, we would really like to ask delegates to ensure ways to not lose the information and to use other ways to keep the OIE informed. So, you know, you can use a spreadsheet and just be safe and store that information so that it can later be incorporated into the Guajis Wild database. And the significance of this is that this information is vital to assess whether the trends in wildlife events are increasing or decreasing, and this will allow for diligent risk assessments and also a tailored design of risk reduction measures. So we encourage you to help with this process. And second, we really want to ask delegates to increase efforts to involve and encourage wildlife focal points to remain very engaged with OIE and the working group on wildlife efforts. And especially for this upcoming general session, we ask that you review the wildlife framework concept note and consider how your countries can be involved and contribute to these efforts.